Imagine a world where the arrival of new workers suddenly stops, leaving bustling fields and plantations scrambling for the hands they once took for granted. In January 1808, a pivotal change swept through the United States and the Caribbean. The transatlantic flow of African slaves came to an end. This shift was not just a matter of politics or trade, it sent shockwaves through the very backbone of plantation economies. Cotton, sugar cane, and rice fields that had depended on the relentless labor of enslaved people now faced an unprecedented crisis. How to maintain productivity without a steady stream of new labor? The plantations had grown immensely profitable, especially with innovations like the cotton gin, which allowed short staple cotton to be cultivated widely across the Deep South. Owners had come to rely on enslaved people not merely as workers, but as the lifeblood of their wealth. The sudden cut-off of the transatlantic slave trade meant that the supply of new enslaved individuals was limited, while the demand for labor continued to rise as plantations expanded. Fields that once stretched endlessly under the guidance of experienced hands now had gap spaces where the absence of workers was painfully obvious. Faced with this dilemma, plantation owners devised strategies to maintain their workforce, some of which were disturbing in their logic. Instead of importing people from across the ocean, they began to look inward, at the lives and families already under their control. Fertility and productivity became commodities, and enslaved families were subjected to a system designed to create new laborers from within. This period marks one of the most unusual and unsettling chapters in history. The organized breeding of enslaved people to ensure the continuation of plantation labor. Amid this challenging and dehumanizing system, certain individuals became central figures in a story that is both tragic and fascinating. One such figure is Pataseka, a man whose life would intertwine with the economic needs and superstitions of plantation society. Standing at an impressive height, he was selected for his physical traits, believed to pass on strength and resilience to future generations. His life, although constrained by the demands of others, also offers a glimpse into how people navigated, survived, and sometimes even influenced a world structured against them. Today, we turn back the pages of history to explore these remarkable yet often overlooked narratives. As we delve into Pataseka's story, we will uncover the human experiences behind the statistics, the faces behind the fields, and the resilience that allowed some to endure unimaginable circumstances. If you want to journey through history and discover stories that reveal both the cruelty and the resilience of the past, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. By doing, you will join a community dedicated to uncovering eye-opening narratives and learning the lessons history has to teach us. Stay tuned, because the story of Pataseka is one that will challenge what you thought you knew about history and leave a lasting impression. As the transatlantic trade came to an abrupt halt in 1808, plantation owners in the United States and the Caribbean faced a dilemma that would shape generations. The labor force that had fueled their vast fields of cotton, sugar cane, and rice was no longer replenished from across the ocean. The plantations had grown into sprawling empires of wealth and power. Yet this sudden scarcity of workers created a crisis that demanded a solution. It was in this environment of desperation and calculation that the lives of enslaved men and women were subjected to one of the most unsettling adaptations of the system: the organized effort to ensure the next generation of laborers through forced reproduction. In the eyes of the plantation owners, human beings were no longer solely workers. They had become a living resource, a means to sustain the fields and the profits they generated. Fertility, once a personal and private matter, was reduced to a matter of economic strategy. Enslaved women, already burdened by relentless toil, were now pressed into service not just to plant, harvest, and maintain the fields, but to give life to the future workforce. Their bodies became instruments in a carefully controlled system, where the ability to bear strong, Healthy children determined their value in the eyes of those who claimed ownership over their lives. Mothers and daughters were subjected to scrutiny. Their physical health, strength, and endurance evaluated as if they were livestock rather than human beings with their own desires, emotions, and dignity. Among those whose lives were most affected by this practice, some names have survived through oral history and legend, revealing both the human cost and the strange resilience that emerged in the face of such control. Pataseka, known for his extraordinary height and presence, became one of the central figures in this story. A man whose physical traits were believed to ensure the birth of children who would thrive in the demanding labor of plantation life. His selection was not random. It was guided by a system that prized certain characteristics: strength, endurance, and even superstition about physical proportions believed to favor male offspring. For Pataseka, life became a cycle of expectation and obligation, his existence defined by the number of lives he could help create under a system that sought to manipulate nature itself to meet economic ends. The impact on the children born under this system was profound and far-reaching. From the moment they were brought into the world, these children were marked by the circumstances of their birth, regarded as assets to be trained, sold, or exploited. Childhood, with its natural freedoms and opportunities for play and learning, was often denied. Instead, children were immediately immersed in the harsh realities of plantation life, performing grueling work suited to their age and strength, learning early the physical demands and rigid hierarchies imposed by the owners. Education was withheld, not merely as a consequence of circumstance, but as a deliberate measure to ensure compliance and maintain control. In this way, the cycle of labor was not only preserved but intensified. The skills and abilities of the next generation molded to serve economic imperatives before their own identities could fully form. Yet within this calculated oppression, glimpses of human endurance and adaptability appear. Some individuals, like Pataseka, navigated the restrictions imposed upon them with a blend of compliance, intelligence, and resilience, finding ways to exercise agency in small but meaningful ways. While his daily life was dictated by the expectations of the plantation, the privileges he occasionally received, such as the management of animals, travel between village and farm, or oversight of certain tasks, offered moments of autonomy that were rare in such a system. These moments did not erase the fundamental injustices or the suffering of the children and women around him, but they illustrate the complex interplay of power, survival, and human will that defined life on the plantations. As history unfolded, the full weight of this system became apparent not only in individual lives but across entire communities. Families were fragmented, ties severed, and identities obscured as children grew into adults who were often sold or moved to distant plantations. Unaware of their siblings or lineage, Pataseka's own descendants, numbering in the hundreds, were dispersed and subjected to the same labor and limitations that had shaped their father's life. The human cost of this calculated approach to labor generation is difficult to measure. Yet the stories that survive speak volumes about the endurance of those who lived within its grip. This chapter of history also highlights the lengths to which systems of power will go to perpetuate themselves, turning basic human functions into mechanisms of control and economic stability. The lives of enslaved women and the children they bore were deliberately shaped to meet demands that prioritized profit over humanity. The intimate, personal realities of birth, growth, and family were subordinated to the impersonal calculations of owners seeking to secure a sustainable labor force in a world where the importation of new workers had been cut off. In this context, the story of Pataseka and those around him becomes more than a tale of an individual. It is a lens through which we can examine the broader structures of exploitation, resilience, and human ingenuity that persisted even under the harshest conditions. Understanding this history requires both empathy and reflection, recognizing the suffering that was endured while also acknowledging the remarkable ways in which individuals and communities navigated such extreme circumstances. The legacy of these experiences continues to resonate, influencing family histories, cultural memory, and collective understanding of resilience and survival. It is a history that demands to be remembered, not as a distant curiosity, but as a powerful testament to both the cruelty and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Amid the sprawling plantations of São Paulo in the 19th century, one man's life would become an extraordinary and haunting chapter in the history of labor and survival. A story that illustrates both the human cost of systemic exploitation and the peculiar ways in which resilience can emerge in the harshest conditions. Roque José Flow, known by the name Pataseka, which translates to dry paw, was an enslaved man whose existence was shaped by forces far beyond his control, yet whose personal characteristics placed him at the center of a system designed to manipulate human life itself. From the moment he entered the world of the plantation, he was recognized not only for his striking physical presence, but also for the economic potential that his owner believed he embodied. Standing at an extraordinary height with long, slender legs and large hands, Pataseka was more than an individual. He was seen as a vessel through which the plantation could secure its future labor force, a living investment whose very body had been assigned a role in an intricate system of human management. The circumstances that led to Pataseka's selection as a central figure in this system were a mixture of superstition, observation, and the ruthless logic of plantation economics. At a time when the transatlantic slave trade had been curtailed, and the importation of African laborers had ceased, plantation owners faced a dire need to sustain their operations, and the solution they devised was as unsettling as it was calculated: the creation of future laborers through controlled reproduction. Pataseka, with his height, strength, and seemingly fortuitous proportions, was chosen because it was believed that these traits would not only ensure the birth of children who could endure the harsh conditions of plantation life, but would also favor the arrival of male offspring, highly valued for their capacity to perform the most demanding work. Within this framework, Pataseka's life became a cycle of expectation and service, defined by the productivity of his body in ways that stripped his existence of autonomy, yet simultaneously placed him in a unique position relative to others on the plantation. Despite the heavy weight of his imposed responsibilities, Pataseka's story is also one of nuanced complexity. Unlike many of those around him, he was entrusted with tasks that offered a degree of independence and trust, including delivering mail and tending to animals, requiring daily travel between the village and the farm. These privileges did not eliminate the fact that his primary function had been determined by his owner's designs, but they created spaces in which he exercised agency, however limited, and developed a sense of self within the boundaries imposed upon him. The plantation, in its calculated efficiency, treated Pataseka almost as a living instrument of production, carefully monitoring his health, ensuring he was well fed, and maintaining him in peak physical condition, as though the logic of his care were no different from that applied to livestock. Every aspect of his life, from diet to daily activity, was oriented toward a singular purpose: the perpetuation of a labor force that would benefit the economic ambitions of the farm. The children Pataseka fathered were born into a world of systemic oppression, their lives immediately shaped by the circumstances of their conception. Over the years, he became the progenitor of more than 200 children, each one entering a system in which personal freedom, family ties, and opportunity were subordinated to the demands of plantation labor. Many of these children would grow up under harsh conditions, performing backbreaking work in the fields or serving in domestic roles, often separated from siblings and extended family, deprived of education, and subjected to strict control. The very act of birth, in this context, was transformed into a mechanism of labor management, a way for the plantation to maintain and expand its workforce without the need to procure additional enslaved individuals from distant lands. Yet within these tragic circumstances, the story of Pataseka illustrates both the endurance of the human spirit and the complexities of survival in a world designed to diminish humanity. Pataseka's experiences also reveal the contradictions inherent in a system that simultaneously demanded extreme compliance and offered limited privilege. While he bore responsibilities that others did not and maintained certain freedoms that came with trust and reliability, these advantages existed entirely within the framework of exploitation, and his agency was circumscribed by the expectations of the plantation owner. Nevertheless, he navigated this life with a resilience that speaks to the ingenuity and adaptability of those who endured similar circumstances, finding ways to fulfill obligations while preserving elements of personal identity and developing relationships that sustained him psychologically and socially within the harsh realities of enslavement. As time passed and the legal and social structures of Brazil began to shift, Pataseka's life moved into a new phase following emancipation, freed from the constraints of forced labor. He married, raised a family of his own, and cultivated land granted to him by his former owner, dedicating himself to farming sugar cane and building a household that offered stability and opportunity to his immediate descendants. Yet, even in freedom, the vast number of children he had fathered during his years as a breeder remained dispersed and largely untraceable, a reminder of the enduring impact of systemic exploitation and the difficulty of reconstructing family ties severed by generations of labor and displacement. In telling the story of Pataseka, we confront the paradoxes of history. A man subjected to control and commodification yet capable of forging his own path, creating life under constraints, and leaving a legacy that speaks to resilience and survival. His narrative allows us to explore the intersections of human endurance, systemic oppression, and the ways in which individuals navigated spaces of power and limitation, often transforming imposed circumstances into opportunities for survival and, ultimately, for a measure of autonomy. In the vast and unforgiving plantations of 19th-century Brazil, the system of labor extended far beyond the work of the fields, weaving itself into the very essence of human life through practices designed to ensure the continuation of a profitable workforce. As the importation of new enslaved individuals from Africa came to a halt, plantation owners faced the urgent challenge of sustaining the labor that fueled their economic empires, and in response, they devised methods that transformed personal characteristics into tools of production. The selection of men for the purpose of fathering future laborers became a calculated process, grounded in the harsh logic of survival and profit. Strong, healthy, and physically resilient men were singled out, their attributes carefully scrutinized and measured against the demands of plantation life, which required immense endurance, unyielding strength, and the capacity to withstand grueling work under extreme conditions. The aim was not merely to sustain life, but to engineer it in a manner that maximized the productivity of subsequent generations. A chilling intersection of human biology and economic calculation. These men were chosen for qualities that would, in theory, be passed down to their children, creating offspring who could meet the exacting standards of field labor, manage livestock, or perform domestic tasks within the household. Height, muscular build, and overall vigor were considered indicators of suitability, traits that would ideally translate into children capable of long hours of toil, resilience under the sun, and a physicality that could endure the demands imposed by owners. Yet selection was not only about functional strength. Perceptions of desirability and social biases influenced decisions in ways that reflected the deeply entrenched racial hierarchies of the time. Men with certain skin tones, facial features, or appearances that conform to prevailing notions of market value were often favored, a practice that exposed the insidious ways prejudice intertwined with economic incentive, reducing human beings to a combination of genetics and potential labor output. Within this framework, the lives of those selected were transformed, their personal freedoms subordinated to the expectations placed upon them. Men like Pataseka, whose towering stature and proportionate frame aligned with the ideals of plantation owners, were designated as central figures in the perpetuation of the labor force. Tasked with fathering children who would inherit both their strength and their enslaved status, the decision-making process was not casual. It involved careful observation, assessment of health, and sometimes the application of superstitions that guided assumptions about reproductive success. Pataseka's physical presence, his long limbs and broad frame, was seen as an asset not only to the plantation's economic strategy, but also to the projection of a lineage of laborers who could meet the exacting demands of life on the fields and within the household. The experience of these men illustrates a profound tension between bodily autonomy and imposed purpose. While their attributes brought them certain privileges or a degree of attention from owners, these advantages existed solely within a system that evaluated their worth in terms of productivity and reproductive capacity. Each day was measured against expectations, the physical condition maintained, the health monitored, the capacity to father children who could thrive under similar hardships. In many, their very identity was reframed to align with the plantation's needs, transforming their bodies into instruments of economic planning and long-term strategy. The men themselves were often acutely aware of the implications, navigating complex social and personal realities as they performed roles dictated by ownership and survival. This system had far-reaching consequences, particularly for the children born as a result of these deliberate pairings. Each child was immediately enmeshed in the expectations of the plantation, trained, worked, and disciplined according to the requirements of labor. The environment into which they were born was one of control and rigor, where the qualities inherited from their fathers were both a tool for survival and a reminder of the circumstances that shaped their very existence. While men like Pataseka were noted for their strength and vigor, the realities for their offspring were stark. The very attributes that made a father desirable to plantation owners became markers of the labor that awaited the next generation. This cycle of selection and expectation reinforced the structures of labor and control, ensuring that the plantation could continue to thrive in the absence of new imports, while simultaneously shaping human lives in ways that prioritized economic outcomes above individual well-being. Underlying this practice was a disturbing combination of observation, belief, and calculation. Plantation owners relied on visible markers of physical ability, often guided by assumptions and superstition, to predict the likelihood of success in producing strong, capable children. Yet even as they exerted control over reproduction, there was an acknowledgement, however tacit, of the humanity of those involved, creating a tension between the dehumanizing goals of the system and the awareness that these were living, thinking individuals with their own responses and resistances. Men who were selected had to navigate this landscape, balancing compliance with survival, negotiating moments of autonomy, and coping with the knowledge that their bodies were central to a process that would shape lives for decades to come. The long-term effects of this system are evident in the patterns of labor, family lineage, and community structures that emerged from plantations. The children of selected men carried forward not only physical traits but also the social and economic realities imposed upon them, forming the backbone of labor networks that were both a testament to human resilience and a record of systemic manipulation. The choices made by owners regarding selection for reproduction reveal a calculated intersection of biology and economics, demonstrating the lengths to which a society can go to preserve and enhance a labor system, while simultaneously depriving those within it of autonomy and self-determination. Through the story of men chosen for their physical traits and the generations that followed, we gain insight into the ways human bodies were assessed, evaluated, and deployed as tools of survival and profit, highlighting a deeply unsettling aspect of plantation life that extends beyond the labor of the fields into the intimate realms of birth, family, and inheritance. It is a history that challenges us to understand the interconnectedness of oppression, survival, and the human capacity to endure under constraints that test the very limits of autonomy and identity, illustrating a system in which physical strength was both a gift and a burden, a measure of survival and a symbol of the calculated cruelty that defined the era. In the midst of sprawling plantations and endless fields under the scorching sun, Pataseka's life unfolded in a manner that set him apart from the majority of those around him, revealing both the peculiar privileges and the complicated responsibilities assigned to individuals whose physical traits made them sent to the perpetuation of the plantation labor system. Unlike many of his peers, whose days were consumed by relentless toil in the fields or in the stifling confines of domestic work, Pataseka occupied a space that blended obligation with a rare form of autonomy, a delicate balance that reflected both his value to the plantation owner and the practical needs of maintaining control over labor. His towering stature and the physical attributes that had deemed him suitable as a father of future laborers became the foundation upon which a different pattern of life was built, one in which daily existence was measured not only by productivity in the field but also by tasks that required trust, skill, and responsibility beyond brute strength. From early in his adult life, Pataseka was assigned duties that allowed him to traverse between the village and the plantation, performing work that combined practicality with the symbolic acknowledgement of his unique status, delivering messages across distances, attending to the care of animals, and overseeing certain aspects of the farm's daily operations placed him in a position that was simultaneously laborious and respected, offering moments of autonomy that contrasted sharply with the rigid confines of the fields. Each day, as he rode between the city of São Carlos and the rural expanses of the farm, he moved through spaces that were both controlled and liberating, exercising a kind of agency that most enslaved individuals could not access, navigating responsibilities that required judgment, attention, and the careful maintenance of relationships with both fellow laborers and the plantation owner. Yet these responsibilities were inseparable from the central purpose for which Pataseka had been chosen, the perpetuation of a workforce through his children. Every aspect of his care, nourishment, and activity was designed to sustain him in peak condition, ensuring that he could fulfill the role assigned to him with maximum efficiency. The plantation's meticulous oversight of his health and well-being underscored a paradoxical reality. While his labor and reproductive capacity were exploited for the benefit of the plantation, he also experienced privileges that provided relief from the most grueling forms of physical punishment and field labor. This unusual position was not one of true freedom but rather a form of carefully managed agency, a recognition by the owner that his value lay in both his physical traits and the capacity to maintain them over time. In navigating this life, Pataseka developed a nuanced understanding of the interplay between compliance and subtle autonomy. While his actions were guided by the expectations of the plantation owner, he was entrusted with responsibilities that required decision-making, organization, and a level of accountability uncommon among those subjected to the strict hierarchies of plantation life. Managing animals demanded knowledge, patience, and skill, while the delivery of messages involved interaction with a broader community beyond the immediate confines of the farm. Each task, though framed within the context of servitude, offered opportunities for personal growth, a form of engagement that contrasted sharply with the anonymity and relentless physicality of field labor experienced by his peers. The unique status Pataseka enjoyed did not eliminate the pressures or the ethical complexities of his situation. While he avoided the exhaustion of the fields, his role carried profound responsibility, as the physical and social well-being of the children he fathered depended in part on his health and ability to sustain his assigned duties. The plantation's interest in controlling reproduction and ensuring the strength of the next generation was inextricably linked to his conduct, positioning him at the intersection of personal survival, social expectation, and economic calculation. His life illustrates the paradoxes of privilege within oppression, where certain individuals were granted relief from the harshest forms of labor not out of benevolence but because their value to the system required careful management and protection. At the same time, Pataseka's mobility and responsibilities placed him in proximity to spaces of learning, observation, and interaction that were largely inaccessible to others, allowing him to cultivate knowledge, relationships, and a perspective on the plantation and surrounding communities that few could claim. This unusual position created a complex social dynamic, as he navigated the expectations of his owner while maintaining connections with other enslaved individuals, balancing the tension between authority, trust, and solidarity. His experiences highlight the intricate hierarchies embedded within the plantation system, revealing how human lives were stratified according to a mixture of physical traits, perceived economic utility, and the plantation owner's strategic considerations. As the years unfolded, the practical and symbolic aspects of Pataseka's responsibilities intertwined, shaping a life that was both constrained and distinguished. His avoidance of the most punishing labor allowed him to sustain the physical condition deemed necessary for his role, while the trust placed in him to manage animals, deliver messages, and navigate interactions with the broader community created a space in which he could exercise judgment, initiative, and a measure of self-determination. These experiences, though framed within the structures of exploitation, offered a form of agency and engagement that stood in stark contrast to the routine of the fields, illustrating how privilege and labor were negotiated within an oppressive system. Pataseka's story, when viewed in the broader context of plantation life, offers a profound glimpse into the ways human lives were organized, controlled, and differentiated. It demonstrates how physical attributes and economic utility could shape not only the labor assigned to an individual, but also the forms of trust and responsibility granted, producing a spectrum of experiences within a system designed to commodify human existence. His life reveals the complex interplay between exploitation, resilience, and the pursuit of agency, showing that even in circumstances designed to limit autonomy, moments of responsibility, mobility, and influence could emerge, providing insight into the multifaceted realities of life under a system that sought to reduce human beings to instruments of production. Through the lens of Pataseka's experiences, we see a story that is both singular and representative, a narrative that illuminates the ways in which personal characteristics, labor expectations, and social hierarchies intersected to create a life marked by both constraint and distinction, and one that continues to offer lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the human capacity to navigate systems of control with ingenuity and endurance. The story of Pataseka reaches its most profound and haunting dimension in the legacy of the children he fathered, a vast and complex web of human lives intertwined with the brutal machinery of plantation labor. Over the course of his years as a designated father within this system, he is believed to have sired more than 200 children, each born into a world where freedom was denied before birth and the demands of labor were imposed from the very beginning of life. These children, like their father, were not regarded as individuals with agency or rights, but as integral parts of a carefully maintained structure designed to sustain the plantation economy. Their existence was defined by the dual inheritance of both physical traits and social status, the latter consenting them automatically to a life of servitude that mirrored the conditions imposed on Pataseka himself, ensuring the continuation of a labor force meticulously shaped by the logic of exploitation and economic calculation. The reality into which these children were born was unrelenting. Their lives were structured by the needs of the plantation, with childhoods defined not by play or learning but by the imposition of work and discipline from an early age. From the moment they were old enough to perform basic tasks, they were put to work alongside adults, participating in the cultivation of crops, the tending of livestock, or domestic labor within the households of the owners. Each day presented physical and emotional challenges, as the expectation of productivity was absolute and the margin for error minimal. Harsh treatment, including strict enforcement of labor discipline and punitive measures for perceived infractions, was the norm, a system intended to instill obedience and endurance while reinforcing the social hierarchy that kept the plantation functioning efficiently. The sheer scale of Pataseka's progeny amplified the impact of this system, spreading his physical traits and, unfortunately, the conditions of enslavement across an entire community. Each child represented a continuation of the plantation's calculated approach to human reproduction, a living testament to the way biology and economic strategy were intertwined. The inherited traits of strength, endurance, and resilience were essential for survival under the grueling conditions of daily work. Yet they came at a cost. The children were thrust into an environment that demanded immediate adaptation, leaving no room for the innocence or freedoms that defined typical childhoods. The plantation's focus on utility over individuality meant that familial bonds were frequently fractured, as siblings were separated and relationships disrupted to meet the shifting demands of labor allocation, sales, and transfers between properties. Despite the oppressive environment, the children, like all those who survived such circumstances, displayed remarkable resilience. They navigated a world in which autonomy was limited and the boundaries of personal agency constantly tested, learning to endure physical hardship, maintain emotional strength, and, in subtle ways, assert individuality within a system designed to suppress it. These adaptations, however, did not mitigate the profound impact of growing up within a structure that treated them as commodities, where survival and labor capacity defined value, and where education, intellectual development, and personal aspiration were often deliberately curtailed to maintain control. Denial of literacy and skill training was a deliberate strategy, reflecting the belief among owners that educated or empowered children might challenge the very system upon which the plantation relied. The generational effect of Pataseka's role cannot be understated. His children, having inherited both his physical capabilities and the enslaved status imposed by law and custom, became a foundational labor force that ensured the continuation of plantation productivity in the absence of new imported labor. The sheer number of offspring he produced meant that his influence permeated the social and economic fabric of the community, creating a network of interrelated individuals whose lives were shaped not by choice but by the circumstances of their birth. Each child carried with them the echoes of Pataseka's physicality and presence, yet their daily realities were defined by labor, discipline, and survival, illustrating the deeply human consequences of a system that sought to manipulate reproduction as a tool of economic sustainability. The treatment of these children, though undeniably harsh, was also varied, reflecting the complex realities of human relationships within the plantation system. Some were sold to other owners, becoming part of entirely different communities, while others remained on the original property, performing tasks that evolved as they aged. regardless of placement. Their lives were inseparable from the machinery of plantation labor, and their social identities were framed by the inherited status of enslavement. Emotional bonds, familial connections, and personal aspirations were subordinated to the economic imperatives of the plantation, creating a landscape in which resilience, adaptation, and subtle forms of resistance became essential survival strategies. Pataseka's unique position and relative privileges could not shield his offspring from the realities of the system he served, a sobering reminder that individual experience under such regimes could diverge dramatically, even within the same family structure. While he maintained certain freedoms and responsibilities that elevated him above ordinary field laborers, his children's lives were constrained by the very roles that his presence had helped to institutionalize. This paradox, where the father's attributes provided opportunity for autonomy while simultaneously ensuring the continuation of conditions of servitude, underscores the complex and often tragic interplay between individual circumstance, systemic exploitation, and generational impact. Through the lens of Pataseka's children, the broader consequences of slavery and labor exploitation come into stark relief. Their experiences illuminate the ways in which human lives were strategically orchestrated to serve economic purposes, how physical traits were commodified and leveraged, and how survival required both physical endurance and emotional fortitude. The narrative of these children emphasizes the continuity of systemic control, the inescapable imprint of generational hardship, and the resilience required to navigate a world in which personal choice was circumscribed by external demands. The story of Pataseka and his offspring is a powerful illustration of the profound, long-lasting consequences of a system that manipulated human life for labor and profit. It highlights not only the physical and social realities imposed upon those within the system, but also the remarkable resilience and adaptive capacity of individuals who endured and navigated these constraints. Through their lives, we gain insight into the human dimensions of historical exploitation, the complexities of survival under oppression, and the ways in which the legacies of these experiences resonate across generations, shaping communities and histories in ways both visible and deeply intimate. The lives of Pataseka's children were marked by the relentless weight of expectation, the harshness of labor, and the quiet anguish of a childhood stolen by circumstance, a narrative that reveals the profound human cost embedded in a system designed to commodify life itself. From the moment of their birth, these children were enmeshed in a world where freedom was not a possibility, and where every action, every gesture, and every hour was shaped by the imperatives of work and obedience. The plantations demanded tireless labor, and the children, often barely able to walk, were thrust into responsibilities that tested both their physical endurance and their capacity to endure relentless discipline. From dawn to dusk, they performed the same tasks that defined adult laborers' lives: tending crops under the unrelenting sun, caring for livestock, and maintaining the structures of the plantation with a precision that left no room for play. Creativity, or the natural explorations of childhood. Each task, each moment of labor, was an extension of the economic design that valued productivity above personal development. And in this environment, the concept of a carefree childhood was effectively erased. Alongside the physical burdens imposed on them, Pataseka's offspring faced profound emotional neglect, a subtle yet pervasive form of suffering that accompanied their daily labor. In a system where children were viewed primarily as future workers, affection, guidance, and nurturance were scarce commodities, and many grew up with minimal contact with their parents, separated either by necessity, circumstance, or the plantation's demand for labor allocation. Bonds between siblings were often disrupted, torn apart by transfers to different properties or the sale of children to other owners, a practice that reinforced the isolation and vulnerability inherent in their existence. The plantation's insistence on control over human relationships ensured that emotional development was stunted, creating layers of psychological strain alongside the already punishing physical demands. In many, these children learned resilience not through support or guidance, but through survival within a rigid, dehumanizing system that prioritized labor over humanity. Education, a cornerstone of empowerment, was deliberately denied, reinforcing the cycle of subjugation and ensuring that these children remain tethered to a life dictated by the plantation's needs. Literacy and skill development were perceived as threats by those who oversaw their lives, and as a result, access to learning was systematically restricted, leaving children intellectually constrained even as they labored with skill and precision. The denial of education had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate plantation environment, limiting future opportunities and perpetuating social and economic disadvantages across generations. Each child grew into a world of expectations and limitations carefully structured to prevent mobility, autonomy, and self-determination, illustrating how the intersection of labor, control, and denial of knowledge work to entrench systemic inequality. The brutality of the working conditions extended into every facet of daily life. Children were expected to perform the same grueling tasks as adults, often under the unyielding heat of the Brazilian sun or in the cold dawns of labor-intensive harvest seasons. Mistakes were met with strict discipline, including forms of punishment designed to instill obedience and reinforce hierarchical authority. These measures, while intended to maintain order and ensure productivity, also reinforced a pervasive atmosphere of fear and control, teaching children early that their bodies and efforts existed primarily for the benefit of others. This environment created profound psychological pressures, shaping a generation that had to internalize endurance, self-regulation, and the suppression of natural responses in order to survive within the rigid constraints imposed upon them. Despite these hardships, the resilience and adaptability of Pataseka's children became evident. Many learned to navigate the complexities of labor, social hierarchy, and familial disruption with an extraordinary capacity for endurance. They found ways to form bonds, communicate, and support one another within the limited parameters allowed, carving out small spaces of connection and solidarity amidst a life dominated by work and regulation. Their capacity to survive, adapt, and sometimes even find moments of agency within such restrictive circumstances speaks to the human ability to endure adversity, demonstrating that even within oppressive systems, life finds ways to assert itself, to adapt, and to persist. The separation from family and community was one of the most insidious aspects of their experience, as it not only fractured emotional bonds but also limited cultural continuity and collective memory. In an environment where lineage and connection were tightly controlled, children were often left without the guidance of their parents or the stability of familial structures, forced to interpret and navigate the world largely on their own or within the confines of small peer networks. These fractures in social structure compounded the challenges of survival, intensifying the psychological weight of labor and deprivation while reinforcing the control mechanisms of the plantation. The emotional consequences of these separations would echo throughout their lives, shaping relationships, identity, and the capacity to form secure attachments in adulthood. Physical hardship, emotional neglect, and denied education combined to create a multi-layered system of oppression. A reality in which every aspect of life was regulated to serve economic objectives. The experiences of Pataseka's children illustrate not only the exploitation inherent in the labor system, but also the ways in which power and control were maintained through a careful orchestration of deprivation, discipline, and denial. These children became both a product and a perpetuator of the system, trained and molded to sustain the structures of labor that had defined their existence from birth. Yet within these conditions, their survival and the small acts of resistance, adaptation, and resilience they employed stand as testimony to human strength. Whether through the quiet endurance of labor, the creation of supportive bonds among peers, or the subtle assertion of agency within limited spaces, Pataseka's children navigated an environment designed to suppress individuality. Demonstrating the complexity of human responses to oppression, their lives reflect the intersection of exploitation, resilience, and adaptation, providing a poignant lens through which to understand the human impact of historical systems of labor, control, and social engineering. Through the narrative of Pataseka's children, we witness the far-reaching consequences of a system that intertwined reproductive control, labor exploitation, and the deliberate shaping of human lives. Their experiences illuminate the cost of such strategies, the resilience required to endure them, and the enduring lessons about survival, adaptation, and the profound human capacity to navigate environments of constraint and challenge, even when freedom and opportunity are systematically denied. Following the abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888, Pataseka's life entered a transformative chapter, one that shifted the narrative from survival under oppression to the pursuit of personal fulfillment and family legacy, a chapter marked by agency, love, and the quiet reclamation of his humanity, after decades defined by labor, reproductive obligations, and the strict control of his every action. Pataseka, now a free man, found the opportunity to reconstruct his life on terms that were previously denied, forging a path that allowed him to cultivate not only sustenance, but also the emotional and social foundations that had been systematically withheld during his years of enslavement. The freedom to make choices, however modest, became a canvas upon which he could build a future that was as much about dignity and connection. It was about survival. And in this new landscape, he embraced responsibilities and relationships that offered the promise of continuity and meaning beyond the utilitarian expectations of the plantation. Central to this new phase was his marriage to Palmyra, a partnership that brought both companionship and the possibility of shared creation. Together, they raised 9 children, a family unit that represented both the joy and challenge of nurturing lives in a world no longer governed by the rigid structures of forced labor. Unlike the hundreds of children Pataseka had fathered under the ownership of another, these 9 children were nurtured in the context of choice, care, and attention, free to develop their identities and aspirations without being immediately subsumed into the machinery of economic exploitation. This family became the focal point of his life, a source of responsibility that was chosen rather than imposed, reflecting the stark contrast between the life he had lived under enslavement and the one he was now empowered to shape for himself and those he loved. In addition to the emotional reclamation afforded by family life, Pataseka engaged deeply with the practical work of sustaining a household and securing economic independence. He farmed sugarcane on a plot of land gifted by his former owner, transforming the skills and knowledge acquired during years of forced labor into a means of creating value and stability for his own family. This land, once a backdrop for exploitation and control, became a site of autonomy, where Pataseka could exercise judgment, diligence, and innovation in ways that directly benefited those he cared for rather than serving the profits of another. The cultivation of rapidura, a form of unrefined cane sugar, required careful attention to planting, tending, and harvesting cycles, knowledge of soil and climate, and the ability to translate labor into sustenance and modest income. And through this work, he constructed a tangible legacy of resilience, skill, and self-determination. The juxtaposition of his earlier life as a carefully managed laborer and reproductive instrument with his later life as a landowner and head of a free household is striking, highlighting the profound shifts that freedom introduced, as well as the enduring echoes of a life once tightly controlled. Pataseka's daily routines now encompassed the full spectrum of responsibilities, from agricultural management to ensuring the welfare, education, and cohesion of his family, allowing him to exercise autonomy in every decision, from crop rotation to the upbringing of his children. These decisions were guided not by the imperatives of a distant master but by considerations of care, sustainability, and long-term well-being, a shift that reflects the fundamental transformation from servitude to self-directed life, and from exploitation to stewardship. Within this period of relative fulfillment, Pataseka's life also reflected the resilience and ingenuity required to navigate the transition from enslavement to freedom. The psychological, social, and practical skills he had developed under extreme constraints were repurposed in service of his own household, demonstrating a remarkable ability to adapt experience into constructive agency. Lessons learned under duress: discipline, planning, observation, and resource management were no longer instruments of control by another, but tools for nurturing independence, stability, and opportunity. The process of reclaiming personal and familial agency illustrates the complex interplay between endurance cultivated under oppression and the capacity to repurpose that endurance in the pursuit of a meaningful and self-directed existence. Pataseka's relationship with Palmyra exemplified the human capacity for connection and care once the structures of coercion were removed. Their marriage was not merely a personal choice, but a vehicle for building stability, love, and continuity, reflecting the emotional dimensions of freedom that had been denied to him for so long. Through nurturing their children, managing the farm, and participating fully in the rhythms of family and community life, Pataseka experienced the rewards of work and responsibility grounded in choice, creating a framework of life that was qualitatively different from the utilitarian demands of his earlier existence. Each child raised, each crop harvested, and each household decision made became a testament to the possibilities of life after servitude, a living demonstration that even after profound deprivation, human agency, care, and fulfillment could be reclaimed and exercised. The stability and autonomy he achieved did not erase the echoes of his past, but rather reframed them, allowing Pataseka to understand and navigate the contrasts between life under ownership and life with freedom. He could reflect on the hundreds of offspring he had fathered without knowledge or connection, recognizing the deep injustices and traumas of that period, while simultaneously witnessing the tangible outcomes of his current efforts in the health, growth, and well-being of his own family. This duality underscores the complexity of his existence, illustrating how resilience can manifest not only in survival, but in the ability to redirect one's energy and experience toward the creation of life imbued with purpose, dignity, and hope. In farming the land, caring for his children, and nurturing relationships, Pataseka transformed the resources, knowledge, and physical strength that had once been exploited into instruments of personal and familial agency. Each day offered opportunities to build a life that reflected his choices, skills, and care, producing outcomes that were meaningful in ways that transcended the mere accumulation of labor or profit. The process of sustaining a family, tending the fields, and engaging with his community allowed him to cultivate not only material stability, but also emotional and social fulfillment, bridging the gap between a past defined by exploitation and a present shaped by freedom. Pataseka's post-slavery life, therefore, stands as a testament to the capacity for human reinvention and the pursuit of dignity, illustrating that even in the aftermath of systemic dehumanization, it is possible to forge a life that is guided by choice, nurturance, and sustained effort. His journey from the extraordinary constraints of enslavement to the responsibilities and joys of family life demonstrates the profound ways in which agency, resilience, and careful stewardship can transform not only one's own existence but also the lives of those entrusted to one's care, creating a legacy that endures beyond the traumas of history and into the realm of personal and communal achievement. Pataseka's life, viewed in its entirety, serves as a profound testament to the resilience of the human spirit amid conditions designed to suppress it. A narrative that threads together the brutal realities of slavery with the extraordinary capacities for adaptation, endurance, and ultimately, self-determination that can emerge even from the most oppressive circumstances. From the early years of his enslavement, when his body and agency were subjected to the rigid calculations of plantation owners seeking to maximize labor and reproduction, to the later chapters of his life marked by freedom, family, and autonomous work, his story encapsulates the duality of human experience under extreme exploitation, one in which survival requires both conformity and ingenuity, and another in which the reclamation of personal choice transforms existence into something profoundly meaningful and generative. In examining the breadth of Pataseka's experiences, one is confronted with the calculated cruelty of a system that sought to extract not only physical labor but also reproductive potential, treating human beings as instruments of economic production rather than as individuals with rights, emotions, and aspirations. The children he fathered, numbering over 200, were born into a world where their identities were preordained by the imperatives of ownership, where their physical capabilities were cultivated for labor, and where emotional bonds were secondary to the demands of survival and productivity. The system stripped away conventional notions of childhood, subjecting young lives to relentless physical exertion, emotional neglect, and separation from family, while deliberately limiting access to education and intellectual development to maintain the control of the owners and perpetuate systemic inequality. Yet within this narrative of dehumanization, the contours of resilience become evident, often in subtle but remarkable ways. Pataseka himself adapted to his assigned role with a combination of endurance, skill, and quiet ingenuity, navigating a life in which autonomy was severely restricted while simultaneously preserving a sense of agency within the narrow margins available to him. His physical and mental capacities allowed him to meet the demands imposed upon him, but they also positioned him to survive and, eventually, to thrive once the structures of slavery were lifted. Similarly, the children who endured the brutal conditions of plantation life demonstrated forms of resilience that transcended mere survival. They cultivated adaptive strategies to navigate the social hierarchies and labor expectations imposed upon them, forged bonds of solidarity with peers when familial connections were disrupted, and, where possible, carved out spaces of personal agency within an environment designed to minimize it. The later chapters of Pataseka's life, particularly following the abolition of slavery, highlight the capacity for human reinvention and the reclamation of dignity after decades of exploitation. Freed from the impositions of forced labor and reproductive expectations, he constructed a life guided by choice, responsibility, and care for his own family. His marriage to Palmyra and the raising of their 9 children marked a profound shift from the hundreds of offspring he had fathered under duress, a transformation that enabled him to nurture, protect, and guide lives in a way that was both intentional and empowering. The cultivation of sugarcane on land gifted by his former owner became more than a means of subsistence. It was a domain in which his knowledge, strength, and labor were invested in a self-directed purpose, producing tangible outcomes that directly benefited his household rather than serving the interests of a master. The contrast between these two periods, one dominated by enforced labor and reproductive duty, the other defined by freedom, family, and self-directed work, illuminates the complex legacies of slavery and its enduring psychological and social impacts. Pataseka's personal trajectory demonstrates how resilience can manifest not only in survival under oppression, but in the deliberate creation of a life imbued with meaning, dignity, and generational continuity once the structures of control are removed. His capacity to adapt skills and knowledge acquired under constraint to benefit himself and his family exemplifies the ways in which human potential can be redirected toward constructive ends, even after prolonged periods of deprivation and control. Furthermore, Pataseka's story underscores the intricate interplay between individual agency and systemic oppression, revealing how personal choices and resilience operate within and against historical circumstances. While the system of slavery sought to reduce human life to labor and reproductive utility, Pataseka's life after emancipation illustrates that the human spirit, when granted the opportunity, can transcend imposed limitations, cultivate community, and foster enduring legacies. The lives of his children with Palmyra, nurtured in freedom and care, become living evidence of the transformative potential of human resilience, offering a counterpoint to the dehumanizing conditions endured by the hundreds of children born under the plantation's reproductive regime. His journey also invites reflection on the broader human experience under oppression, demonstrating that endurance, adaptability, and the pursuit of purpose are not merely abstract qualities, but tangible forces that shape survival, identity, and the ability to construct meaning even in the aftermath of profound injustice. The narrative of Pataseka challenges us to consider how systems of exploitation leave imprints across generations, while also highlighting the extraordinary ways in which individuals reclaim autonomy and agency, turning experiences of suffering into foundations for life-affirming choices and legacies. In its full scope, Pataseka's story is a vivid testament to the resilience inherent in the human condition, capturing both the horror of exploitation and the enduring capacity for recovery, growth, and self-determination. It demonstrates that even in circumstances engineered to limit humanity, individuals can navigate, adapt, and eventually create lives of dignity and purpose. His experiences and the lives of those he directly influenced reflect the intertwined realities of suffering, endurance, and hope, providing insight into the long-term consequences of historical systems of oppression, while simultaneously offering inspiration about the transformative potential of resilience. Ultimately, the life of Pataseka reminds us that history is not only composed of the systems and structures of oppression, but also of the remarkable capacities of those who endure, adapt, and reconstruct meaning in the aftermath of suffering. It illustrates the complex legacies of slavery, the persistence of human resilience, and the ways in which individual lives, when directed toward care, family, and purpose, can transcend even the most harrowing beginnings to create lasting impact, illuminating lessons about endurance, agency, and the indomitable potential of the human spirit. As we reach the conclusion of Pataseka's extraordinary story, it becomes clear that his life was not only a singular journey of resilience, but also a living reflection of the broader currents of history, society, and systemic injustice that shaped Brazil over more than a century. Born into a world in which his humanity was subordinated to the economic ambitions of others, Pataseka endured the structured cruelty of slavery, a system designed to exploit bodies and lives with little regard for personal agency or dignity. He witnessed firsthand how human beings could be reduced to commodities, valued not for their individuality but for their labor, reproductive potential, and the ways in which their offspring could perpetuate a cycle of servitude. Yet, within this context of profound exploitation, he survived, adapted, and ultimately reclaimed a measure of autonomy that allowed him to construct a meaningful life for himself and those he loved. Pataseka's lifespan itself is remarkable, not merely because of its longevity, but because of the breadth of historical transformation he observed and experienced. He was born into slavery in Sorocaba, São Paulo, a time when human life was controlled with meticulous precision, when reproductive capacity could be dictated, and when families were frequently torn apart for profit or convenience. Over the decades, he witnessed the end of the transatlantic slave trade, the intensification of plantation economies, and the brutal realities of child labor. Reproductive exploitation, and the commodification of entire generations. Each of these elements contributed to a social structure built upon dehumanization and the calculated extraction of value from human beings. Yet through all of this, Pataseka endured, navigating his assigned role with both resilience and, at times, a quiet ingenuity that allowed him to survive in circumstances designed to suppress individuality. The abolition of slavery in 1888 marked a pivotal turning point in Pataseka's life, transforming him from a property of others into a free agent responsible for his own choices, family, and livelihood. This transition highlights both the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring challenges posed by the long-term impacts of systemic cruelty. Freed from the literal constraints of enslavement, Pataseka married Palmyra, raised 9 children, and cultivated sugar cane on land provided by his former owner. The work he undertook post-emancipation was infused with purpose and choice, rather than dictated by the narrow and cruel priorities of another. Yet, even as he built a life grounded in autonomy and care, the echoes of his earlier years of hundreds of children fathered under coercion, of families fractured, and of the relentless physical and emotional demands of plantation life remained an undeniable presence, illustrating how the legacies of slavery are woven into both personal and collective memory. Pataseka's longevity allowed him to witness seismic changes in Brazil, including the proclamation of the Republic in 1889, the rise and fall of political leaders, periods of dictatorship, and social movements that reshaped the nation. Each of these historical events intersected with the contours of his own life, offering context for the societal forces that had long dictated human lives and labor, and providing insight into the ways in which systemic structures of exploitation can persist, even as individuals strive to reclaim agency and dignity. His death in 1958 at the remarkable age of 130 brought to a close a life that spanned eras of oppression and transformation, and the thousands who attended his funeral bore witness to the impact he had on his community, not only as a survivor but as a symbol of resilience, endurance, and the complex legacies of slavery. Reflecting on Pataseka's story, it is impossible to ignore the dual realities that defined his life: the cruelty of systemic oppression and the extraordinary capacity for adaptation and renewal. While his early years reveal the calculated mechanisms through which enslaved people were controlled, exploited, and commodified, his later years demonstrate the ways in which freedom, however belated, can offer opportunities to rebuild, nurture, and cultivate a meaningful life. His journey illustrates that even in circumstances designed to dehumanize, individuals can assert agency, construct family bonds, and generate economic and social stability for themselves, transforming the legacies of suffering into evidence of resilience and purposeful living. Pataseka's life also serves as a reminder of the broader historical truths about slavery and its enduring consequences. The exploitation he endured, the children he fathered under coercion, and the systemic cruelty of the plantation economy reveal how deeply slavery was embedded in the social, economic, and cultural fabric of Brazil, and how those legacies continued to shape society long after formal abolition. His story encourages us to confront the human cost behind historical systems, to understand the profound intergenerational effects of oppression, and to appreciate the strength required to survive and rebuild in the aftermath of such conditions. It is a narrative that challenges us to recognize both the injustice of the past and the remarkable potential of human endurance and regeneration. As we close this story, we are reminded that Pataseka's legacy is not defined solely by the hardships he endured, but by the resilience he demonstrated, the family he nurtured, and the life he was able to construct once freedom became possible. His journey from a man controlled by the demands of others to one who lived with agency, purpose, and care for his own family embodies the remarkable spectrum of human experience and provides enduring lessons about survival, perseverance, and the pursuit of dignity against overwhelming odds. Thank you so much for watching and for taking the time to honor the story of Pataseka. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you can continue to explore these powerful narratives of history, resilience, and human endurance. Your support allows us to keep bringing these stories to light, connecting the past to the lessons and reflections of today. From all of us here, we wish you a peaceful night and sweet dreams. Good night. And may you carry the strength and courage of Pataseka's story with you as you rest.